Hello, everybody. Once again, I am Leland Crafton Jr., aka Zorval Chan Less Than Guru, and today I want to talk about failures in game, in tabletop role playing game, and how failures are kind of used more recently. If you want to call it new school, you can call it new school versus old school. Um, Again, if you watched my previous videos, you can probably understand that I'm in this weird area where I sometimes agree with old school and I sometimes agree with new school type things. Kind of like each group is kind of on a sliding scale towards one extreme or another. And I'm very fluid on what I see as the purpose of a specific game, being the system as well as uh, the content being provided and the players. So I think all three of those things kind of work with each other and might help or hinder depending on how you do things. And I wanted to do this as failures, as I mentioned, because there is a new school philosophy which I really agree with. Certain stories works well about failing forward, meaning a scenario that somebody brought up that I'll use an example was if uh, you need to cross a lake or a a large lake to get to the other side, and your game master says roll me a boating or whatever the skill close to the ship's boating, whatever that skill would be in a certain game, give me that roll. And either the person that's assigned to that job or everybody rolls, but the point is no one succeeds. So what happens? Old school kind of mentality, again, I'm saying this very loosely because not all old schoolers do it this way, and not all old schoolers did it that way in the past, but there was more of a, if you failed your role, you failed. And in that mindset, you're trying to cross that lake, you failed. You did not cross the lake. Depending on the game master, they might bring up that, the boat capsized, now you have to swim back, or you got lost, or many different things might have happened, but you did not succeed in your task. And if we shift things to the other side of the line, we get what's known as fail forward. And in that, it's basically you succeed, but something negative happens. So it's kind of the idea of getting lost in this lake or not crossing this lake is not exciting. It doesn't help the plot. It doesn't move things along. So therefore, in a narrative, don't have it. It doesn't advance anything. So what you do instead is maybe you give everybody a couple of points of damage and saying that you got off course and it took you longer and you're more tired, and that's presented by damage. Or you get lost and it takes you a long time, or a wind comes up and you aren't able to do it. You get to the other side of the lake, you get to where you want to go, but something negative happened. Maybe a lot of times passed. Maybe the opponents noticed you and you had a certain amount of time and it took too long and they noticed you, so now they're reinforced or something like that. So you still have a negative happening, but even though you failed in the role, you advanced forward, and that's why it's called failing forward. You're still advancing the plot. And I just wanted to give my opinion on that because when that was first brought to my attention as a way to do things, a lot of times when things are brought to my attention, I'm like, oh, wow, that's a really cool concept. That is something that I might use in the future. And I have used that. But it's one of those things also, then after I use it a million times, then some part of me also goes, hey, when you just fail, sometimes that works as well, or works well in a different type of situation. So then that always gets me thinking, what are the situations where failing forward might have a benefit, and what situations would just failing and you do not accomplish what you're doing might help. Help. I'll put that in air quotes because the players are sure not going to think that it helps. But I'll give an example of the fail forward. And what I think those work well with are games that are on some type of story path, whether it's a Pathfinder adventure path, a D&D module, which can be one to multiples, or something like a Torg Eternity mega adventure. All of those things, the plot of that scenario, of that adventure, the important part is going from the beginning to the end. And that's why in the past I said for these types of plots, these adventure paths, these mega adventures, that where character death is kind of bad. It's one of those things where you like to see the same character start at the beginning and make it through. That's kind of winning. And usually at the end of those, not always, but a lot of times at the end of those, you might retire the characters, especially in a Pathfinder adventure path, because they kind of take you from level 1 to level 20, min to max levels. And then when you start a new adventure path, you start over at level 1 again. So you really can't take those characters, advance them further. That's kind of more, even though there were stuff like that back in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't as much as it is now. Before, you would get something like an adventure module, and it would be a setting, and it would place all these things and would tell you what were in these things, these places, what kind of creatures and monsters and civilizations and villages, and who might leaders be, etc. But it really wasn't a here's these clues, they lead you here, they lead you here, they lead you here, they lead you here, and here's the overarching plot. They would be kind of like, these people are here, and this is the bad thing they're doing. Here's all the rooms, here's where they are. And the game master would kind of come up with most, not all, but most of the plot. But in that way of thinking, that old school way of thinking, sometimes you just fail. You fail to do something. And there were a lot of games back then that if you failed, it wasn't like you fail and then you try again and you try again and you try again. It was a fail. And until that, like whatever that thing was that you failed, until you got that up higher, a lot of times if we use D&D terms, if you got up another level, then you could try again. Or with other games, they'd have something else, like maybe points could be bought independently, skills could be purchased independently, raised independently. Once you raise that skill again, then you could try again. So maybe you went off and did something else, got some experience, raised that up, and now you try to cross that lake again. You got some more boating experience or something like that. In these plot arc, these adventures that span multiple books or one book with multiple acts in it, for the Torg Eternity mega adventures, that stopping and making them do other things before they can cross that lake or pick that lock or whatever that thing that they failed at would kind of slow down the plot, because you get the plot and you want to get to the end. Boom. You got an objective, and getting to that objective is the goal, and anything that impedes or slows down that goal might get some players kind of worked up a little bit. Where if you go with here's the setting, here's the places, here's the thing, and the plot's just kind of what the game master does, and what the focus on isn't the focus on the overall story arc. It's the characters and who they are and what they do, whether they fail or succeed. Then that failing as a failure and not failing forward can help in those type things. So basically what I kind of want to say with this is the failing forward is good and it works well in those adventure plots. But if you want to try something else, if you want to go OSR, old school Renaissance type gaming, don't always think that you have to continue with this mega plot. Not every adventure, every situation is we have to save the world, we have to do this. We have to get from, we have to get to the last point, the big bad end guy, the BBEG, who's going to destroy the world. A lot of times it wasn't that. A lot of times you did have false starts. If you watched my previous video in the Palladium Ninterra Veil homebrew mix mash hodgepodge game that I'm currently running and inventing rules up on the fly, you'll see that the party got hurt and a failed heal check meant that they didn't heal. And so instead of advancing forward, they went back to town. And then when they went forward again, they learned there were many patrols out there. So that always going back to town to getting healed, they weren't ever going to get anywhere. But they did it the first time. And they then hopefully figured some things out. But certain things like that, if they fail, and they might not accomplish their mission. But that's not going to necessarily be the end of the game, because it's not a all encompassing the world's going to end if they don't do this. The big bad guy is going to do something horrible and tremendous. And the way that they're going, this kind of warlord has set himself up in the area, and he'll just solidify his power in that area. It doesn't mean that he's going to take over the whole Ninterra Veil. It doesn't mean that he's going to destroy everything. He's just going to establish himself. And they failed in that way. Maybe they'll succeed other places, but it's not something that it's something that will have consequences, but it's not something that you don't go forward. And what I mean like that is, if I have a Torg Mega Adventure or a Pathfinder Adventure Path and they fail and they don't progress, then I have more books or more of a book that no longer applies. If I'm on Act 2 and the party decides to leave and say Blood on the Blasted Lands, which are Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific, if they get to a certain end of an act and they think that they've completed what they need to do, or if I make it so that they failed and there's, they cannot progress because of a roll, then the rest of that book that I have is not going to be used, at least for them. And the same thing with an adventure path. If you adventure paths are usually 6 books in Pathfinder. Some of one of the big long ones from AD&D 4th Adventure was 9 books, and if you get 1 or 2 books into it and it ends and that roll stops it, then there's a lot of extra books you might have bought that you no longer use for that group, or you have to go and do something else, and then they get stuck there, and then they come back, but then maybe they're too high of a level, and you're playing combat as sport instead of combat as battle. So then your levels are mixed up, they're not getting XP, or they're getting too much, and things like that. That does not work so well. But in a game where you don't have those objectives, where you don't have that plot line, you're not losing those books. You want combat as battle, not as sport. So maybe they go away, they get some experience, and they come back and they kick butt, because the things that, whatever the creatures were there before that they were equal to, but they failed a roll, and then they went away, gained some experience, gained some levels or equivalent, depending on the game, and then they come back and they mop the floor of these things. That's okay if that's the game you're playing. If you're not playing a combat as sport, sometimes if you're playing combat as battle, the party, the player characters, it doesn't always mean that you as a game master are sending horrible things after them and going, I'm doing combat as battle, so you're going to die. Sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes it's the player characters that come in and wipe the floor with the enemy just because they're so much more powerful, because they decided to do something else over here before they did this thing. And that's kind of can be exciting and fun to watch the PCs see, or the players see how much better they are since they advanced. It might get them to think about things in a different way. So again, I'm not saying either way is good or bad. I do like the fail forward philosophy with those story arc games, those plot lines. that have multiple books or one big book that you don't want to just stop. You want to get from the beginning to the end. But when you have more of an old school, I'll use the term sandbox, but the bigger sandboxy type game you get, sometimes let those failures fail. Let those happen. The uh, let the party have to stop, have to reassess things, have to go. Maybe they go back and maybe they don't have to go back and get a ton of experience. Maybe they have to go back and just learn something. Like, okay, let's take some sailing courses or something. And when you go forward, you're like, okay, here's a bonus. Since you did this, you learned a few things and move it forward. But basically, my thing on this is failing can be fun. And to add to it, it's not necessarily a fail and a check, but in the last 3 tour games I played as a player, in 2 of them, the party failed. We failed our objective. One of them, we didn't quite understand what the objective was, and we went into it with a totally different mentality than we should have, which is on us. That was our fault, not the game master's fault. We decided to go into Aurosh and Torg Eternity as if we were going into the Nile or Tharkold or Living Land or any of the other realms, and just we'll go in and we'll beat things until we win. And that's not Aurosh. And as one of the authors of Aurosh, I, as a player, should have known that, but it just seemed like we were doing things fine. We were accomplishing what we did, and it was like, oh, we don't need to investigate on this one. If we would have investigated, we would have realized that every action that we did was helping the big bad end guy. And it was hilarious at the end to get to it and just realize that our mentality, because we didn't change it, and because I, as a player, should have known it, that we did everything that the bad guy wanted us to do, and they succeeded. We didn't die, luckily, so that was somewhat of a success. Yay us for not dying, but it was pretty good. And as one of the players stated, this was the most fun I ever had failing, and I tend to agree that that was a lot of fun. And then another one was one that I still don't quite understand. Did we fail or did we not? It seemed like we failed, but it seemed hard to win in that case. And sometimes you just have to take your lumps and live with it. Sometimes you can't always win. And that's one thing I did want to mention, even in those adventure paths and those mega adventures that you want to fail forward, when it does get to the end, if the party fails, it's not completely game over. And what I want to mean by that is in old Torg, in the original Torg, at the end of every adventure in the back, and I've mentioned this before, they have, and people who know about the Infiniverse, the original Infiniverse, they'll understand this, that you filled out the form of did you accomplish goals, did certain NPCs live or die, etc. You would send it into West End Games, they would calculate stuff, and then kind of what the most majority of the sheets that were turned in stated, that's kind of what happened in the main official rule. And that's how it is one of those, which I've said many times with Torg Eternity, is every game master's world is canon. It's official what the game company makes, but everybody is canon in the world. Each individual cosm can affect the big thing, the big picture. So it's all canon. All your house rules are canon. All your plotline diversions, etc., are canon, and that's to help the people who can't get off that mindset. I always have to be canon, and what the game company states I have to do, no matter what my players do. And that's one of those things that I do want to present is when you get those end games, as soon as I would see it, I would know what would happen, whatever the good result was, whatever the party's success was, because game masters tend to, when they get to that end, they will even help the party if needed to get the good result because they want the players happy. And I just want to say that sometimes that end result, them not getting it, they'll learn from it, or it'll bring up new opportunities. And the one that I want to state for this, and then I'll wrap this video up, is High Lord of Earth. High Lord of Earth was an old original Torg adventure. Basically, it wasn't necessarily High Lord of Earth, the Darkness device that was trying to get a High Lord and make a new realm was from a different world, but it was kind of a little crazy and had some amnesia type thing happen to it. But it wanted to establish a new type of Aztec empire reality in Mexico area. And basically, what happened is at the end there were different ways to win, but one of them being a complete win. And in the official story, what the majority of people turned in, it was a it went all the way. It was the full win, the full blown party wins. And in my group got to the end and they did the partial win or the temporary win, and they didn't really think beyond that. They were, oh, we won. And then they did some things and they left and they didn't do the full end. And as a game master, I bit my tongue and I just let them do that. And then each game session we had afterwards, I would see if they ever said, "Oh, we want to," because a lot of times they'd say, "Oh, we're contacting our contacts over here. We want to see what's going on there. We want to see what's going on there." They never went back to that place. And after a few months, basically what happened is the darkness device was not cut off permanently. They didn't bring down the stele. It came back and then nobody was there to defeat it the second time, and the Aztec Empire came up. I call it Azteca, but the Aztec Empire came up in my world, and that's how the world in my uh, personal cosmverse works, or is set up. And that is because the party failed, but it added stuff. So then when we started doing Toward Eternity, and I made the Paraverse as a kind of a Infiniverse exchange based off of that world, I have Azteca, and that meant that players could be part of that. They could make Azteca characters, and I came up with Azteca cosmic cards and Axiom, the world laws, and stuff like that. And one of the players played one of those characters and had a lot of fun doing so. So there's things like that, that even if the players fail, and they fail majorly, this set up a new realm on the Torg core Earth. Kind of an invader, kind of not. A very different one that wasn't brought in by the Gaunt Man, and it added a lot of stuff because they failed. And it's one of those things. Game masters, let your players fail if you're doing that type of thing. Now we were going through an adventure. They got to the beginning, they got to the end, but they failed at the end. If they would have failed before that, it would have been set up as well. So sometimes that does work even with a plot arc, instead of necessarily always failing forward. But I just want to bring up those things. Failing forward works. And in certain situations, like, okay, we're going to cross this lake. And since it's a lake, we could just walk around. So if we fail, we just walk around. When it's something like that, sure, give them, give them a minor thing, let them move on. But if it's a big boom, here's the thing, you failed, you don't get that information. You got to choose: do I put this information somewhere else for them to get the is a failure? They get the smallest piece of information to get them to the next place, but something else bad happens. Think about that, but don't necessarily always do one or always do the other. Look at your group, look at the situation they're in, look at the adventure you're going in or the situation they are, and types of stuff like that. But failing can be fun. It can it can in the moment seem bad and be bad, but in the future open up new opportunities for players. Even though there is this whole other bad realm out there, a player then gets to choose a character from that realm. He's fighting against that realm, but he's making a character from that realm, and certain things like that can happen. So basically, that's kind of where I wanted to go with this. With failures in tabletop role playing game, you can fail forward, and I have no problem against that philosophy. But also, on the other hand, just failing outright can sometimes be pretty cool as well. You can have fun failing. So I just wanted to say that. And until next time, I am Lehman Crafton Jr., aka Zorvalchan Less Than Guru, and I will catch you